The Joe Rogan Experience.
Explain the record you broke. You ran 24 in less, well, it was 100 miles, and it's a 24-hour time period, but you did it in 11 hours and 40 what minutes?
Yeah, so it was, I'll explain a little bit there. So it was, the event itself was called 6 Days in the Dome, and really what it was you could do anything from a 24-hour event to a 48-hour event to a 6-day event and just see how far you could run within that time frame.
6 days.
Yeah, I know there's some crazy people out there. So just wait till David Goggins finds that event. And then but yeah, so I've been, it's interesting because there's not a lot of timed events that are necessarily structured for 100-mile or for like 12 hours. So a lot of times you find yourself jumping into some of these other events that are longer in duration and just kind of using them as a way to try to run a fast 100-miler or a fast 12-hour. So the race director for that particular event had reached out to me because he's known me for a while and knew that I was targeting fast 100-mile times and just said, hey, I've got this cool event set up at the Olympic Training Facility in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the Pettit Center, and I think it's going to be pretty conducive for fast times, and asked if I wanted to do it. So I actually didn't have an ideal timeline that I would have normally wanted to work with in terms of getting ready for it, but training went really well, and I went there targeting the 100-mile world record, which was 11 hours, 28 minutes, and 3 seconds prior to that, and ended up running 11 hours, 19 minutes, and 13 seconds for 100 miles. And then since we have like this 100-mile distance and also this 12-hour timed event kind of structure, you can find yourself, if you're under 12 hours, kind of double dipping and getting 2 events for the price of 1, I guess you could say. So I kept running after I hit 100 miles and ended up going 104.88 miles total in the 12-hour time frame.
So that was another record?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's 2 world records, 100 miles in 12 hours.
Dude, 6 minutes and 48 seconds for a pace for 100 miles is fucking bonkers. That is so fast. That's so crazy. That's such a fast pace, man.
Yeah, it's funny, like, when you look at it, because I think sometimes people look at, like, 100 miles in 11 hours and 19 minutes, and there's not a lot of context in their mind unless they're kind of familiar with ultramarathon running. Mm-hmm. But when you start to break it down into, like, the subcategories where it's like, well, that's, like, 4, like, sub 3-hour marathons in a row, or I can't remember how many, or what the 5K time is. There's, like, it's like 31 5Ks at some time.
That's 4 sub 3-hour marathons in a row.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so crazy. That's so fast. And are you still eating mostly meat?
So, this gets brought up quite a bit, I think, because, I eat a ton of animal products for sure. But I wouldn't classify myself as a quote-unquote carnivore or quite in that.
Well, this is because the carnivore diet people want to claim you.
Right.
And we discussed this kind of the last time you were here, where you take in a lot of glucose and you ramp up your carbohydrates considerably before a race. Mm-hmm. But like, what is a daily diet? Let's say in training, like you're preparing for something like this. What's a daily diet for you like?
Yeah. So, let's jump into that. I think there is some nuance within that even, because when you think of my lifestyle, the way I like to describe it is if you took a calendar year and you grabbed a single day out of there and you grabbed a day where I was at like a peak training day versus a recovery day, those are like so drastically different in terms of my energy my energy demands. So like things tend to fluctuate quite a bit and change quite a bit. And I think that's oftentimes what confuses people, because they look at what I'm doing, say, on race day, or they look at what I'm doing on one of my big workout days or my rest day and think that's what I'm doing across the board. So when you get the folks saying, oh, well, Zach follows a carnivore diet, they're probably looking at like a post-race recovery day where then I might be eating almost all just animal products, a lot of eggs, a lot of salmon, red meat, that sort of stuff. But if you pick a day out where I'm doing like a big training day, doing like a 30-mile run or something like that, that's where I'm going to kind of bring back some of the carbohydrates to try to supplement that activity. And the best way to maybe describe it is, there's like this like kind of train low, race high, or this carb periodization concept that's getting more momentum behind it and more studies and science behind it too. There's some interesting folks that are looking into this in more detail. And if folks are really interested in doing a deep dive in it, there's a guy named Dr. Mark Bubbs. He wrote a book called Peak, and he kind of dives into kind of like some of the nutrition science, where it's been and kind of where it's kind of heading, and they highlight some of that. And one of the big things they're starting to recognize that even with the elite athletes, when you're periodizing your training like I do, your nutrition should be being periodized as well. The science is pretty clear that like if you're doing a workout and you take in glucose or fructose, I think most science says a 2-to-1 ratio is ideal for maximizing the amount you can take in. Then you're going to give yourself an advantage. That's like rocket fuel. So then it becomes a question of like, do you need that 100% of the time, or do you even want to do it 100% of the time? Because when we look at elite,
can I pause you right here?
Yeah.
When you say glucose 2-to-1, like what do you mean by that? And
glucose to fructose.
Okay.
Because what they found out is when they started doing a lot of like the exercise science and nutrition was that the real limiter is your gut. So like on paper,
so absorption.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a finite amount you can absorb, and you increase the amount you can absorb on average if you have that 2-to-1 ratio versus all of one or the other.
So 2 glucose to 1 sucrose.
Yeah.
Interesting. And now, what are the different sources for glucose versus sucrose? Like sucrose is simple sugar that you get. Is that more like a refined sugar?
Yeah. I think like the way like most like sports supplements and things like that are going to be designed to kind of meet those specific, because they're looking at the literature and they're seeing like, okay, this is how you optimize
so like a Powerade or a Gatorade or something like that would be a 2-to-1.
Yeah, I'd have to look to see exactly if they have that, but my guess would be they would be if they're looking at the research and where that's kind of at. But yeah, so like really the question that I think needs to be asked with a lot of this stuff is like, if I want to make a workout feel as easy as possible, if I can get in like say 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, it's probably going to do that. Like my perceived effort at that pace is probably going to feel easier. But then you have to ask the question, like, how often do you need it to feel that easy? So for me, the answer to that is like, well, if I'm doing something really strenuous or something that's in a little bit of a gray area where it's just fast enough to dip into the glycogen stores, but just slow enough that I can do it for quite a while, like maybe even a couple hours, then you're kind of in this area where that could be an advantage for me from a performance standpoint. But if I'm going out for an easy run of like 60 to 90 minutes and it's going to be like a 2 to 3 out of 10 perceived effort anyway, like there's no real need for me to be hitting glucose during that or, sports drink during that to make that feel even easier yet. Because my goal isn't necessarily to make an easy run feel even easier, I guess is the way to
it's
maybe
hilarious.
describe
So you
it.
call a 90-minute run easy. That was nothing, just a stroll, just a few dozen miles.
Well, and I think that also brings up a really good point too, where like a lot of this stuff when we're looking at carbohydrate usage and performance is we're looking at elite athletes. We're looking at folks that are training for like, the Olympics. Sometimes they're even Olympic medalists. And that's just not a very good comparison, I think, to the average person who's out there running, because their purposes are different, their objectives are different, their lives are very different. Like one is doing basically everything around a specific date and distance and trying to run as fast as they can on that date. And another person may be trying to run as fast as they can, but there's so many other factors in life, like their work, their relationships, their the level of training they're actually able to have with the time they have, and then also like managing their own health and nutrition. Because like elite athletes don't have a very rosy picture in terms of long-term health either. So for someone who's like maybe 10, 20 pounds overweight and is trying to run to get into shape or train to get into shape or something like that, they're probably thinking just as much about health as they are about performance. So for them to be shuttling in 60 grams of carbohydrate every hour during training and racing is probably not the direction that they'd want to go.
Now, when you get ready to do something like this 100-mile run, how many miles do you run on a typical day? And do you ramp that up, or do you just give yourself a base and know that you can push through? Like, how do you handle that?
Yeah, so I'll build up my training. The way I kind of describe it is like I'm always focusing on specificity kind of being king. So depending on the race, distance, and the intensity is kind of how I'm going to structure my workouts. So the rule of thumb that I use is the closer I get to the workout, the more specific the workouts I do are going to be towards that race distance and intensity. So for me, what that oftentimes means, since I'm training for like 100-mile distance races, is early in a training block, I might be doing some like shorter interval work, like VO2 max. Like an example, that would maybe be like a 3-minute kind of almost all-out effort, followed by like a 3-minute recovery jog, and then another 3-minute interval like that. Some of those real short interval sessions.
And how many of those would you do in a row? How many sprints versus recovery?
Yeah, it'll depend. I'll start like pretty easy. And the first one, when I first started, I might just do 3x3 on that. But my goal really is to every week is to kind of build volume within that. So that first week it might be just 3 of them, But by like say the 8th week, I might do a total of like 24 to 27 minutes worth of volume within that VO2 max context. So it's really interesting because like, you know, I could go out on any one day and do like maybe 10 of those. But if I do that and then it takes me like a week and a half to recover from that session, it's not nearly as probably effective as if I spread that out a little bit and said did like 5 by 3 and then 5 by 3 days after that.
Give your body a chance to recover and build versus just destroying it all in one and then feeling like shit for a couple weeks.
Exactly. I like to call it micro stressing when I'm working with folks and my own training. I'm like, we want to micro stress. We want to stress you just enough to elicit a response. And so you get stronger, and then we want to do that over and over and over again.
Are you aware? I'm sure you are. You know who Pavel Tsatsouline is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's got this sort of concept when it comes to weightlifting, with kettlebells in particular, calling greasing the groove.
Yeah.
Whereas instead of doing all these sets to failure, you would just do like half of what you're capable of, and then do it again in a more frequent pace. Like do it again, rather, do it again on Wednesday, do it again on Friday, and then give yourself a lot of time in between each individual activity too, particularly when you're training for strength. He actually recommends as much as 10 minutes of recovery in between sets, which is, kind of crazy. I mean, most people don't have the time for that. 6 sets is an hour in. I mean, it seems like you're just laying around at the gym. People would, if you were at the gym, people would mock you. But that's his protocol.
Yeah, and I think endurance is, like say, it's a patient person's game. So I think if you can build that volume in a micro stressing or in a sustainable way, that's what's going to keep you or get you strong, and it's also going to make it less likely to get injured.
How much time do you need? Like if you got up to that insane pace that you did when you ran the 100 miles, if you took like a week off or 2 weeks off, how much would you lose?
Not much in that amount of time, especially at that intensity. So the thing is like the 6:48 mile pace, we need to be kind of relative about it. So like for me, when I'm out training, when I'm fully recovered, that's like a pretty reasonable pace from an intensity standpoint. So the interesting thing about ultra marathoning is race pace is sometimes faster than even some of your easiest runs in training. So your training is kind of all what we would call like overspeed training. Whereas in most endurance events from like the 1500 up to like the marathon, the majority of your work is going to be sub race pace. And then you're going to have like, depending on the program, maybe 20-30% of that be like overspeed training.
Why is that?
Well, just because the relative duration of the event is so long, like, I can't run fast. Or if I run too fast, then it's just going to end badly for me.
Right, but why is that with marathons?
Well, because it's similar to strength training, where like if the limiter is like the amount of like stress you put on your body. So if I was going to train to peak in, say, a marathon, my max potential pace for that wouldn't be sustainable to do every run. So I'd be running too hard, too fast, too often, and then we'd get into that kind of situation that we were talking about before, where you're starting to macro stress versus micro stress.
So if you run a marathon, what is your standard marathon pace?
So I'm a little goofy, where I competed in high school and college, and then I did some marathons, but not really in a structured manner. And then I got an ultra marathon running, so I haven't really done what I would consider a real legitimate marathon training program.
So you're basically saying marathons are for pussies, right? Is that what you're saying? Just say it.
I actually think I actually think marathons are maybe the hardest event of them all.
Really?
And I'll explain why. Because
you're going fast.
Well, yeah, it's just short enough where you have to be pushing like a fairly intense pace, but it's just long enough where if you make a mistake, you're going to pay for that for quite some time. So you're on such a razor's edge, and you're also just one tiny mistake away from things going really badly.
And what you're saying about mistake, you're talking about pacing, like if you go out too hard.
Yeah.
I see your watch. What is it? What kind of watch are you wearing?
It's a Coros Apex.
Well, I've never heard of that one before. Is that a GPS watch? One of those?
Yeah, it's relative. They're a relatively new brand. Like in running, I guess like the two kind of big players historically have been Suunto and Garmin. And Coros kind of came to the market a few years ago. They wanted to try to take that high end technology, but make it maybe a little more affordable and also make it user friendly. Because now everyone's they care more about the post-workout or the post-run data that you're uploading to these platforms like Strava. So like Coros kind of made it a big point to make it real user-friendly on that end. So I get done with the run and I load it up to the app and it's up on Strava like within a few seconds sometimes. And Then you go dissect all the data, like how much elevation gain and loss, your pace per mile, all that.
And is this primarily a running watch?
I mean, you could use it for running or cycling or hiking or mountaineering or anything like that. It's got like all those kind of bells and whistles on it.
Oh, okay. So if you're, my question was like, so if you're running, are you checking your watch if you're doing a marathon? You're making sure that you're not going crazy, because is it otherwise you just have to kind of gauge it just based on the pack and based on how you feel?
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good, especially when you get into ultra marathoning. I think the metric that people should dial in the most is their rate of perceived exertion, because that's something that's not going to necessarily lie to you. Like if you base your stuff off heart rate exclusively or a pace exclusively, you can find yourself like justifying something that's not necessarily where you need to be. And if something like that malfunctions and that was your like only compass, then you're in trouble. So I like, when I'm doing my training and when I'm working with other folks, I like to use heart rate and I like to use pacing and stuff like that. But ultimately I'm trying to get the person to really understand like how hard is this effort, and then across the board, from like very easy to very difficult. And then when it comes time to race, we can kind of dial in like this is the intensity you're trying to look for, so that they can kind of feel that out.
Do you use a metric? Like do you say like how do you feel 7 to 10?
Yeah, pretty much. I have a scale of like 1 to 10 that I'll use a lot of times, and there's like a whole variety. Like most people are going to be using some sort of like probably like zone system of training where there's numbers that are associated with heart rate ranges or intensities, and there'll be descriptors. And there's some that are like 1 through 20. There's some that are kind of 1 through 5 and then 1 through 10. And
isn't that so weird too, right? Because it's subjective. I mean, the Whoop strap is something I wear, and it uses something like that. Like, what's your perceived exertion? I'm like, I just push it towards the far right. I don't know. Like, what does that mean? Like, it's so hard to gauge your perceived exertion, especially when the workout's over. Yeah, it was hard. I went I went all out. Like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it can be tricky, and it is very subjective. But I think it's one of those things where it falls into the same category that a lot of endurance events are, where you just got to be patient and really work on kind of understanding that. And you learn from experience too. Like you find out like, oh, I went and did this workout, and I thought that was the right pace and intensity, but it turned out to be a little too fast.
Do you keep a training log?
Yeah.
And do you like write it on Excel or something like that?
I basically just load all my stuff up to Strava, and then so that's kind of like the go-to for most runners these days.
But I'm sorry, but do you keep like a diary? Like today felt like this, and this was an issue, and I felt like I didn't have enough fluids, or do you do anything like that?
Not so much anymore. I did it a lot when I was in college, and I did it a lot when I first started, when I was really trying to kind of learn my body and kind of learn what things mean and how I respond to them. But now I've been kind of doing it long enough where I have enough of a like an understanding of kind of how, like, when things go wrong, like why they did, or if something went really well, like why it did, that I don't feel like I need to take as detailed notes. But I think it's really valuable for someone who's especially while they're trying to learn the rate of perceived exertion and kind of really dial those things in. It's probably worth their time to write that stuff down, so that they can look back at it and they have that resource available to them as they're kind of reflecting on things.
Now, say if you're getting ready to do something like this crazy 100-mile run, trying to break a world record, how much time are you giving yourself to really truly prepare for that? Is it based on how you're at right now, like what your baseline is, like what kind of preparation you've done before you knew that this race was available to you? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, no, and we can kind of hop back to where I was talking about before, because like when I was talking about the VO2 max workout stuff, that's kind of early in my training plan, because that intensity is very unspecific to a 100-mile pace. That's those VO2 max workouts are much closer to something shorter, like a 5K.
So what are you trying to do with those VO2 max workouts? Are you just trying to elevate your base?
Yeah, like just there's the different systems of training, and that's kind of a higher intensity system. So it's not very relevant to the race pace that I'm doing specifically, but it's not irrelevant to my overall aerobic efficiency. So like by doing some of those faster things, you can work on things like your form, and just because when you're running that fast, like things tend to be a little more dialed in, and it basically what you do is you give yourself kind of a bigger range of what your potential is going to be when you start focusing more in on like the aerobic side of things that we're going to see like as I would move further down in the training plan. So once I kind of do that section of training, to answer your question though, like ideally I'll have maybe about, since I'm coming into most programs not completely out of shape, like 4 months is kind of the sweet spot for me.